Everybody. So welcome to the EPA Climate Lecture. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was supposed to be a hybrid event, but unfortunately we are having problems with our stream at the moment, but we are going to record the entire event and it will be on YouTube tomorrow, so you can re-watch it should you so choose. And we're delighted to be here in the banking hall at the College Green Hotel today. I know that many of you have been with us as part of the EPA lecture series before, but I'd also like to welcome newcomers in the audience and to those of you who would have been joining us virtually, and you will see this tomorrow. We have over 600 people registered to attend the event tonight, with people joining us ideally online and abroad and overseas. My name is Dr. Lara Dungan, and it's my pleasure to be your chairperson for the evening. We will begin shortly with an opening address from Lea Berrang, who's Director General of the EPA. Our lecture this evening, Climate Change and Health, From Paralysis to Pragmatism, will be delivered by Professor Lea Berrang Ford. Currently, Professor Berrang Ford is head of the UK Health Security Agency Centre for Climate and Health Security and a research chair in climate and health at the Priestley International Centre for Climate at the University of Leeds. Professor Berrang Ford is an expert in climate change impacts on health, adaptation to the health effects of climate change, and the health implications of decarbonisation. Professor Berrang Ford was a lead author on the 2022 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report. She's a co-author on the 2022 report of the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change and led the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative, an international collaboration of over 125 scientists to assess evidence on progress of global adaptation to climate change. The lecture tonight will be followed by a Q&A session with Professor Berrang Ford. For our in-house audience, you may ask questions by raising your hand, but can you please wait for the microphone before asking your question because we are going to record them all. Just some very quick housekeeping announcements, so please note the emergency exits. Please ensure that your mobile phone is on silent, and if you are posting on social media, which we greatly appreciate, please use the hashtag #ClimateLecture2024. Please remain seated for the duration of the lecture. The lecture and the Q&A are being recorded, as I mentioned, by the EPA, and the material will be made available on the EPA Ireland YouTube channel, along with recordings of many of the previous lectures, following on from the event and may be used by the EPA for future communications. Now, to kick us off, would you please welcome to the stage Lea Berrang, Director General of the EPA.
Thanks very much, Lara. And the good news is we're back online. So it's been a little bit tortuous, but thank you, everybody, for your patience. It's really important that where we can get people to join us online, we do that as well. So, look, thank you very much for either coming in person or coming online, and delighted to have our first climate change lecture of 2024. And as many of you will know, the Climate Change Lecture Series, it's an important part of the Government of Ireland's national dialogue on climate action. We have presented over many years some of the world's leading climate scientists, decision makers, influencers, and it's all about encouraging public debate and discussion. It's great to see many familiar faces amongst the audience, and of course it's also great to be able to welcome some new people to these lectures as well. And maybe to kick off and talk about what we believe in Ireland, or what we think about in Ireland with regard to climate change, the recent Climate Change in the Irish Mind report of the EPA indicates that 8 in 10 people in Ireland are worried about climate change. More than half think that people in Ireland are being harmed right now by climate change, while 95% believe that the future generations of people will be harmed. The direct and indirect impacts of climate change on human health will affect each and every one of us, which makes it a fitting and important topic for tonight's lecture. So, as Lara said, it's great that Professor Lea Berrang Ford has come over to join us, and I'd have to say this is one of the best titles of a lecture we've had. So, Climate Change and Health, From Paralysis to Pragmatism. So really looking forward to your insights. And of course, I'm delighted that Lara's here to join us and to act as chair for the evening as well. And we know that climate change will have a wide range of global consequences for human health arising from extreme weather events such as heat waves, storms, flooding, increasing suitability of regions for invasive species, implications for mental health, and impacts on antimicrobial resistance. These will bring additional and new challenges for our critical health infrastructure, including hospitals and care homes. And it also includes challenges for planning and coordinating responses to emerging risks. And all of this requires a multi-sectoral and a coordinated approach to address. So it's no small task. And when we look in the Irish-specific situation, Ireland's climate change assessment, which the EPA published earlier this year, it highlighted that climate-related health and well-being impacts for Ireland include things such as, although may sound positive, reducing excess cold mortality rates as a result of lower cold extremes in winter, but conversely seeing increased impacts of heat stress, particularly as our population ages in the coming decades. And in fact, I think we've already started to see that with some of the summers we've had in the last number of years. We'll have longer growing seasons, but this may lead to an increase in respiratory diseases such as asthma as a result of increased circulation of pollen and spores, as well as public health issues arising from poor water quality, arising from extreme rainfall and flooding. We also cannot underestimate the consequences on psychological health and well-being that can result from loss of valued places, flooding, and other extremes. Effective climate adaptation is needed to avoid unequal health and well-being outcomes for communities, but also to realise the opportunities and benefits for individuals, public health and society. And when we look at opportunities, these of course include things such as more green and blue spaces, more secure water and food supplies, improved indoor and outdoor air quality, increased active mobility and better quality housing. And this is all if we adapt and we adapt properly to climate change. So Professor Ford is going to outline how to move from a state of paralysis in the face of climate-related public health challenges to one of pragmatism. Her insights into the work of the new Centre for Climate and Health Security within the UK Health Security Agency, I think will be of great interest to everybody here this evening. We also, I'm advised, will be an optimistic vision of how nations can address the challenges in a planned and pragmatic way. And I think we really need optimism in looking at how we deal with these issues. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Professor Ford. As we said, the lecture will be up on the website, live streamed now, and up on the website. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lara and Professor Ford for the evening. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome to everyone online. Sorry for writing you off so quickly. Thanks, Laura, so much for that introduction. It really highlighted the importance of this evening's lecture, of the direct and indirect effects that climate change will have on public health, which are heightened as our population ages over the year ahead. Just a reminder, if you are posting on social media, please use the hashtag #ClimateLecture2024. Okay, now to get to the main event, would you please give a very warm welcome to the stage, Professor Lea Berrang Ford.
Thank you very much for that really lovely introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here. This is my first time ever in Ireland, and I have gotten such a very warm welcome. And thank you for taking time out during dinner time, eating time, to be here. So hopefully I will take you on a journey with me from the doom and gloom that we're often left with, or we feel that we're stuck in, to hopefully leaving the room with a bit of a sense of optimism. So you've already had enough introduction to me, so I won't reintroduce myself. Let's jump right in. Bit of context. 2022, the summer of 2022, we saw a major heat wave across the UK. And in the UK, we saw close to 3,000 excess all-cause deaths. It was also the first time we issued a red extreme heat alert. So this was really a sort of a step change in our experience of temperatures. We had record temperatures got beyond 40 degrees. Many of you may remember around June to October 2022, we saw major floods in Pakistan, really these sort of catastrophic extreme weather event. 2023, Greece is the example I give here, but really this was across different areas of Europe. Wildfires really throughout a range of countries at levels that we haven't experienced before. This is actually a personal picture from one of my local supermarket stores in 2023, where there were entire sections where there was no fresh produce available. And the signs, thought were quite interesting, took this picture, due to adverse weather, and this was adverse weather outside of the UK where we import our food from, these products aren't available. So this is I found this a really interesting example of how climate change internationally can have direct implications for our domestic experience, in this case, food supply chains. And then finally, just this past summer in Paris, we had a cluster or a small outbreak of dengue cases in Paris, transmitted by the Asian tiger mosquito, Aedes albopictus. So these are some examples that many of you will be aware of, where we're increasingly seeing really the salience of climate impacts on health in our regular lives. So we're on track probably for about 2 to 3 degrees of warming. I say probably because we really don't know how much will warm, but this is sort of a best guess, and that's assuming relatively rapid decarbonization. So many believe we'll be unlikely to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming. We're probably looking at closer to 2. If we don't rapidly decarbonize, we're looking at 3 or above. Even if we were to decrease our emissions to 0 today, we would still see increasing temperatures and increasing impacts. I think these are facts that this audience is probably very familiar with. And that will have a range of implications for health. Climate change does not necessarily directly impact health, but what it does is it impacts the determinants of health, and it will really be the context within which we'll need to protect a wide range of health outcomes from changes in their determinants, be those societal or ecological. And I'll talk a little bit more about what those look like. So this is this is quite a wordy figure, and what I really want to communicate here is the range of health outcomes, in some cases very complex causal pathways by which climate changes can impact health. Some of them, many people are quite familiar with, things like heat. When we get extreme heat, mortality increases. And many of you in this room might say, well, actually, I wouldn't mind a little bit more sunshine. It's quite nice. But actually, if you're older, if you have chronic conditions, if you have different health challenges, even small changes in temperature can increase your risk of ill health and increase your risk of death. And like I showed you earlier, we had excess deaths during heat waves. So we know that temperatures kill people. And this applies to both heat and cold. And I'll talk about the difference in those a little bit later. Outdoor air quality, climate change can affect aeroallergens. We can also have impacts through indoor air quality, and I'll hopefully have a slide on that later. Flooding, something people are often aware of. The greatest impacts of flooding on health in Ireland and in the UK are through mental health, and often these are really slow onset impacts, sometimes hard to attribute to flooding because they can occur months and even years later. Vector-borne infections, and actually not just vector-borne infections, also waterborne and food-related infectious diseases. Many pathogens are climate sensitive. So that's not just the mosquito, for example, or the tick who are climate sensitive and might move into new areas. This is often, in many cases, also the pathogen itself. The pathogen's life cycle could be climate sensitive as well. Same thing for waterborne and foodborne infections. And then mental health. There's a range of mental health implications of climate change, and that could be either from, for example, flooding impacts on people's livelihoods, all the way to anticipatory mental health concerns. So climate anxiety, younger generations who are genuinely thinking of not having children because they don't want to bring children into the world. Older generations who have genuine sense of guilt for what they're leaving to younger generations. And I think we're increasingly beginning to understand the experiences of mental health impacts, but it's really one of the most poorly understood areas, I would say, in the field. And so the other thing I wanted to flag here is the range of causal pathways. So climate change doesn't directly impact health. What it does is it manifests its impacts through existing social vulnerabilities. So you might have the same heat wave in one area as another area, but much higher and much greater impact in one area if there are more vulnerable people, if there's poorer housing, if there's poorer response. And so it's these social vulnerabilities that will shape the way that climate will impact our health, but those are also the entry points. So the entry points for intervention are not only decarbonizing, but shifting our social vulnerabilities so that we can be more resilient to climate hazards. One thing that's not typically talked about as much is these cascading and compound impacts of climate change. And in many cases, it won't be the individual impacts of climate change, but the complex interaction of climate impacts on societies, economies, et cetera, that can be the most significant. And so that might be through implications for health and healthcare systems. So it's not just heat that's going to affect vulnerable individuals. If heat means the transport, parts of the transport system shut down, or electricity goes down, or people can't make it to work, or really are struggling to work in particular conditions, that's going to have implications for people needing care. So you can have these sort of cascading effects. A couple examples of some of these more compound cascading effects would be things like collapse of international crops and food volatility, things that, maybe if we're just looking at Ireland or just looking at the UK, we might not think about, but actually conflict, resource-related conflict, et cetera, can have implications domestically. That applies as well to things like forced migration, geopolitical unrest, climate refugees. These are some of the less predictable, the so-called known unknowns that might be the greatest impacts, but are the most difficult to understand. And then finally, while climate wasn't part of the story for the emergence of COVID, it could be part of the story for the emergence of the next pandemic. So thinking about climate change in the context of pandemic preparedness is important as well, because again, many infectious diseases are climate sensitive. The CCC, the Climate Change Committee in the UK, very recently rated the UK's progress on climate change as not sufficient. This is our challenge. This is the challenge of the centre that I lead within the UK, to see that change, to improve that. And I put in one of the statements from the CCC's report, which I think is sort of an excellent salient statement, that very long-lasting policy and investment decisions being made today need to consider a wide range of changes in climate for the second half of the century. So in many cases, the change in climate and its impacts between now and mid-century are predictable. It's what happens after mid-century that the differences really start to diverge. And you can see on the right-hand side where we're going right now. At the moment, the implemented policies, the sort of red zone, we'll call it, is not bringing down temperatures. It's not really going to be successful. In order to actually combat climate change and minimize impacts, we need to see drastic cuts. And we don't know if we're preparing our children and grandchildren in the second half of the century, don't know what world we're giving them. We have to prepare our health systems for really a range of outcomes. We have to make sure our interventions and our decisions are robust to a range of outcomes, ideally ones that are easier and cheaper to adapt to. So I put this slide in here, is climate projections, really those green lines are those that are consistent with below 1.5 degrees of warming. So this would be sort of best case scenario. And the gray are other scenarios, so higher levels of warming. And what I'd like to flag here is even if on the left-hand side emissions decline and decline rapidly, we still see on the right-hand side warming continuing. And in a best case scenario, the right-hand graph, green, temperatures will peak mid-century. That's the best case scenario. In a less best case scenario, temperatures continue to go up. Where are you going to be mid-century? Sounds really far away, but it's not. Hopefully, all of us will still be here, right? I will be mid-century when temperatures are quite high. I will be probably getting towards that vulnerable over 65 generation. I'm gonna be that vulnerable group. My children will be in their working age years. We're not talking about generic future generations. We're talking about you and your children and your grandchildren. A child born today will live through the peak of climate impacts on health in a good scenario. In a bad scenario, your children, their children, your grandchildren will get it even worse. So this is not theoretical future generations. And so there's this excellent graph or infographic from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that really tries to communicate this, flagging the different experiences of generations. So this is sort of me and my generation. Some of you are probably in my cohort. And we are those who are going to be entering our golden years during potentially peaks, or when we really start to move into the more active period of climate impacts. And it's going to be my children who will either experience a world that's better and improved, or much, much, much worse. That's pretty big. I mean, my experience is probably written in terms of impacts. My children's experience could either be better than mine or much worse than mine. These are not theoretical future people. These are my children. These are your children and your grandchildren. So I really want to sort of drive in that point. These are not theoretical future generations. So how do we assess the risks to health? At the UKHSA, we recently, just this past December, published a report assessing the health effects of climate change. So in this presentation, I'm presenting information from the UK. However, I think it's highly, highly relevant to Ireland. Mosquitoes don't go through border checks. Heat does not stop at the border. We, in many cases, share risks. We may differ in vulnerabilities. We may differ in how we respond to these risks, but we share a lot of the similar risks. I think it's, so while, forgive me for presenting the climate data, or the data from the UK, but I do think that it is relevant to this sort of collective audience. We're in this together. And in our assessment, we found that the strongest evidence, there's strong evidence for climate impacts on heat and cold, so temperature, and this is really well researched, flooding, particularly impacts on mental health, and vector-borne diseases. And I'll give you a few details of that. There are also implications. The evidence is a little bit weaker, more in the moderate range, for the implications of climate change on UK food security because of international implications. So we are importing a greater proportion of our food from other countries, and in particular from climate-sensitive countries. And so that's going to have implications for food chains, food prices, and food volatility domestically. There are a number of emerging risks. So these are risks that kind of aren't quite in public attention. We're not quite seeing them at high levels yet, but we can reasonably anticipate that these are issues that will come online and we'll need to be thinking about. Those are things like drought and wildfires. Colleagues in Portugal, and certainly some of my colleagues back in Canada, wildfires are one of the major challenges. Every year when I visit my family in Canada in August, it's smoggy pretty much most of August, and there's wildfires somewhere. Beautiful sunsets, okay, but really, really poor air quality almost annually. And so these are the sorts of things that the UK doesn't really suffer from, droughts and wildfires to a large degree now, but I think we can anticipate that that's coming. There's mixed evidence on aeroallergens. So there are some allergens that we think will potentially increase with climate change. Some may be less so. In some cases, it depends upon the level of warming. So at higher levels of warming, we'll actually potentially see aeroallergens, the risk decrease because of drying, too much heat and drying for particular species to grow. So that's a very complex area where the evidence is still a bit mixed. And then there are some areas where there really isn't enough of an evidence base to assess, but where we're kind of interested and we'd like to keep an eye on and improve the evidence, and that's things like climate impacts on exposure to chemicals. So think of flooding and how flooding can impact the movement of chemicals and waste sites, and UV radiation. So I want to dive a little bit into these few areas where we do have pretty strong evidence. Vector-borne disease. This has hit the media attention a lot in the UK recently. So one of the major concerns with vector-borne disease in the UK, although not the only one, is the movement, the northward march of Aedes albopictus, otherwise known as the Asian tiger mosquito, northwards through Europe, and it's essentially moving. We can see it moving and coming our way. So Aedes albopictus is on its way. It will come. It's a matter of getting ready with our surveillance and monitoring and deciding how much are we willing to put in resource-wise to delay its entry and to keep it out. Now, the reason Aedes albopictus is of interest is because A, it's a nuisance mosquito. These are teeth with wings. These are the mosquitoes that make you think, my next home, I should put screens on the windows and doors. And there are parts of the world where houses are built with screens on the windows and doors, and it's because of mosquitoes like this. So nuisance sounds like a light word. It's not. But more importantly than that, this mosquito is a competent vector of pathogens, including dengue, chikungunya, and Zika virus. And so one of the things that really highlighted the potential risks for the UK was watching Paris struggle with outbreak just this last summer of dengue. And so that was a bit sooner than we expected. And we know that Paris is not that far from London. The UK has historically been too cold for survival. But we're not anymore. We could actually have transmission now. So we're increasingly having suitability. And here, in this case, these graphs are modeling the future potential suitability for dengue transmission in the UK. This is using a sort of worst case high warming scenario, okay? But you can see by the second half of the century, you can have, at a high warming scenario, you could have large swathes of the UK suitable for dengue transmission. And the first place, the sort of highest risk place that we would be looking at would be concerned about dengue transmission in London. Flooding. The graphs here, I'd like to flag two things in the figures. One, the distribution of risks is not equal. Some places are at greater risk than other places. And 2, risk depends a whole heck of a lot on how much we warm. Okay? So the difference between a 2-degree rise and a 4-degree rise, I just noticed one's 2050 and 2080. I have to check that. But the difference between a 2-degree rise and a 4-degree rise is the loss of entire communities. Okay, so it matters whether we can decarbonize. It matters. Do we have to adapt communities? Do we have to migrate people out of communities? Or can we keep people in communities and adapt them to where they live? And so these differences in warming matter. And there are a number of health effects that can be associated with flooding. The main ones and the dominant ones in the UK are mental health, and I believe it's the same for Ireland. Heat. This is an interesting one. So the media and the Twitter trolls, or the X trolls, like to say, well, there may be heat-related deaths, but won't there be a decrease in cold-related deaths? So actually, there's either no impact or maybe even a net benefit. The answer is actually no. We're going to see a rise in heat and cold-related deaths in the UK. If you look at the far left-hand side, you can see a creeping up of heat-related deaths from around an average of 1,500 or under 2,000 per year excess deaths, up to, and this is a high warming scenario, again, up to potentially over 20,000 heat-related deaths per year. That's a big increase. Let's look at cold, the 2 right-hand sides. The middle figure is mortality associated with extreme cold, and so we will see a decrease, or we do predict a decrease, but actually the vast majority of the mortality in the UK due to cold is due to moderate cold, and that trumps extreme cold, that trumps heat-related deaths. The main mortality that we're getting due to temperature is moderate cold. And we will not see improvements, we will not see declines, or we do not predict declines in that until at least the second half of the century. And the reason for that is an aging population. So people are aging into vulnerable ages. So there may be less risk per person, there may be less cold, but there are more people vulnerable to that cold as our population ages. And again, this is a similar demographic trend in Ireland. So in fact, what we will predict is an increase in heat-related deaths combined with a continued increase in cold-related deaths till at least probably closer to late century. Equity. So I mentioned before that climate impacts on health will manifest through existing social gradients. Some people are more vulnerable than others. And in fact, this is very predictable. And this list, if you just look at it, might look a bit familiar. It looks a lot like the list we all saw during COVID. And for that matter, it's a pretty similar list to a lot of health outcomes. So the most vulnerable groups across most health outcomes, these are sort of the commonalities, although it will differ between different health outcomes. Older adults, children, those with pre-existing medical conditions, individuals less able to adapt their behavior or control environments, so people that might be in controlled environments such as social care, homeless populations, special settings like schools and prisons, sometimes transport systems, people of low socioeconomic status, neurodivergent people are often found to experience more severe outcomes as well, possibly because of more limited ability to control or adapt their environments. One of the biggest drivers that will really intersect with climate risk is our aging population, which will put us, there'll be basically a greater proportion of our population that is vulnerable. Now that provides an opportunity for targeting our interventions for older individuals, often living and aging alone in poor housing without access to interventions and without access to support. So we can target our interventions. Excuse me. But there are also these emerging risks that we're discovering, these new areas that go beyond the obvious stuff like heat and vector-borne diseases and flooding. And one of them, just one, that I wanted to flag is climate change and antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. The first time somebody mentioned this to me, I was asked, is there any link between climate change and AMR? And I said quite confidently, no, there's no link. But they put a bug in my head, and for the next 2 years, I marinated on it and I festered on it, and I started talking to colleagues and had meetings. And what we've uncovered over the past few years is there are so many ways in which climate change and AMR intersect. One of which is that increasing temperatures can increase the rate at which AMR emerges. And these are just 3 papers that support that. And so in the last couple of years, we're actually seeing an explosion of research and evidence and literature starting to highlight this association. So this is just one example of sort of a new area where we're discovering a new pathway by which climate will intersect with major health challenges. So that was paralysis. I said I'd add in some optimism. So how do we move forward? How do we go from that doom and gloom to a pragmatic, maybe even optimistic future? So I like to call it public health 2.0, not only sort of a new approach to public health. We want to change our public health and have it resilient, but also possibly public health at 2 degrees or higher. So what will that look like? In the UKHSA's Centre for Climate and Health Security, we've identified 8 areas to help us operationalize our national response to climate risks to health. And these are the 8. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I want to go through several of them to give you an idea of how we are trying to be pragmatic and professional, move away from paralysis in how to deal with climate threats to health. The first, evidence and case for action. I think most of us are familiar with the idea of, well, we just need to go out and find out what the risks are to health, get an evidence-based, do risk assessment. But we really need to go beyond that. We need to get to the point where we're looking at evidence to support responses. Not only what are the problems, but what might the potential solutions be? What can we do? Can we evaluate efficacy? Can we get economic assessment to get a monetary case to support action? Get evidence to take action, not just to understand our risks. So moving from risks to responses, that's one. And there is a lot of optimism here. So many of the adverse impacts from climate change are avoidable through climate change mitigation or decarbonization, and others are preventable through effective adaptation. So things like national heat and cold alerting systems can be incredibly effective at offsetting health impacts. Flood defenses, improvements to housing will be very significant. The UK and Ireland both have very old housing stock, and that will be one of the greatest challenges, but it's also an opportunity. Okay? It's a really valuable lever. Improved ventilation, shutters on windows, there's plenty of examples. There are also a number of measures to mitigate. Okay? Mitigation will reduce the severity of impacts. It can buy us time. It can buy us time to upgrade our housing stock. It can buy us time to develop vaccines. It can buy us time to ramp up our monitoring systems. It can just buy us time for our farmers to transition. So mitigation isn't about just necessarily even stopping climate change. It's about slowing things down so it's occurring at a pace that is a bit more feasible to adapt to. Reduce the costs of adaptation. Okay, higher levels of warming will be very, very expensive to adapt to, at some point prohibitively so, and to minimize the impact on health services, buy us time to adapt our health services. But there's also benefits in this transition to this new world, this net zero world that we and our governments are committing to. There are a lot of win-win options. So we really don't have the luxury of trying to decarbonize and also trying to protect our health systems. We have to find that small intersection of interventions that are good for health, that are good for decarbonization, and that make us more resilient. And the good news is there are lots of those. It just so happens, and this wasn't guaranteed, this is serendipitous. Let us be grateful that many of the climate actions, many of the things that are good for climate action are also going to make us healthier. They're good ideas anyway. There are a lot of no regrets options, not all of them, but there are a lot of no regrets options. Things like active transport, so that's moving that involves your body, so biking, walking rather than being in a car, for example, not only reduce localized air pollution, not only are good for decarbonization, but they're good for our physical health, for people that are able to engage in those activities. Nature-based solutions consistently come out as win-win options when we do assessments. So nature-based solutions, that's usually sort of greening landscapes, greening roofs, that sort of thing, can provide shade, reduce flood risk, improve air quality, benefit mental health. There are some trade-offs. So willy-nilly greening can, if not done carefully, can create new vector habitat and can impact aeroallergens. So we do have to be careful about making sure we're maximizing benefits and minimizing trade-offs. But if we do, there really is a lot of opportunity for health benefits. And there's good evidence for some of this. So health impacts from extreme weather really are preventable and have quite an economic cost. So this one estimate here, the cost of heat-related mortality for the UK, approximately 6.4 billion a year. Strong evidence of economic efficacy, high benefit to cost ratio, and you can see on the graph, I don't know if it's clear enough, but heat and heat wave planning and weather services include early warning alerts. So this is strong, economically supported evidence of the efficacy and the value for money of early warning systems for heat. And this supports one of our key priorities that we undertook, and that's to implement, improve, upgrade, and really invest in our early warning systems for heat, sorry. Okay, shared vision. This is sort of a new priority for us, but what we found is when we were talking to stakeholders, partners, doing consultations, people would say, oh, I see so many doom and gloom scenarios. I can envision these horrible futures that are laid out for me, but I don't know what good looks like. I don't know what good looks like, and I don't know how to get there. It's sort of, and we actually spent some time saying, envision 10 years from now, 15 years from now, what good looks like, and people couldn't answer the question. So spending some time providing a vision of what good might look like and what those steps are to get there has become a key priority for us. And there's ways to do this. There's different methods that you can take. And so I pulled this picture from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, because I think it's a nice example of how simple things like visuals can help people. And one of the things we've talked about is what does a future healthy, sustainable house look like? Can we take this complex information on housing, which is, well, we need to make houses more energy efficient, but we don't want to reduce ventilation, and we don't want them to overheat. And we also don't want mold, and we want the air quality to be good. So how do we sort of, and there's challenges with, radon, which is a health issue, increasing if it's too sealed and energy efficient. So how do we manage all this complexity? It's quite a complicated space, but it's one that we might be able to communicate through visuals, where you actually say, this is what a house might look like in the future if we try and balance all these needs. We can also do narratives, storytelling, backcasting, and highlight the co-benefits. This is about creating optimistic visions and alternative scenarios. We have strong operational response, so simply making sure when there is a problem or when we're dealing with today's challenges, heat waves, flooding, that we're ready for what's happening today, not just thinking about the future, but responding today. So the UKHSA last year released the Adverse Weather and Health Plan. So this was a step change, and we combined the previous heat and cold weather plans for England into a new plan. And we also updated our weather health alerting system to make it specific for health, so that when there is a heat wave, for example, we don't just release information on, well, it's hot, okay? It's not just based on heat, but we have new thresholds that take into consideration information on when heat is a problem for health, as well as other factors. If there is an infectious disease outbreak at the same time, if there's a major event, if there are any other reasons, if humidity, for example, if there's anything else, we sort of have a more holistic view, and then we cascade targeted action cards and guidance to health organizations. Okay. And again, remember, these are the approaches for which there is strong evidence for cost effectiveness, right? Monitoring and surveillance. When it comes to vector-borne disease, it's all about prevention, okay? Once you discover Aedes albopictus, invasive mosquitoes in multiple locations, it's too late. You literally have to be checking constantly, and you want to catch it really, really early to either keep the vector out or slow the vector getting in. So early investment is everything when it comes to monitoring and surveillance. Remember those stories about how we discovered that COVID had been circulating in the UK and Europe far earlier than we thought, and we thought we were keeping it out, but it was already there quietly circulating. That's the same story for vector-borne disease. The mosquitoes and the pathogens will circulate quietly without our knowing it, unless we have really intensive monitoring and surveillance. And so at UKHSA, we lead monitoring and surveillance. We have a team, the medical entomology and zoonoses ecology team. These are the folks tramping around in the mud, putting out tick and mosquito traps. Really intensive season. It's the tick season right now, and later in the year, it'll be the mosquito season. We do preparedness and response, so working closely with European nations, because that's where Aedes albopictus is coming from, and doing risk assessment and trying really to come up with solutions. How do we respond? Contingency planning. And of course, we can do all the evidence generation we want, but how do we influence policy and action? How do we catalyze policy and action? So UKHSA, so the agency I work for, doesn't make policy. We inform it. So we have to walk that really fine line and be policy relevant without being policy prescriptive. And that is a fine line, but it's a really important one. So how do we inform policy? Well, we have lots of guidance. This is informing action. So lots of guidance, trying to meet people where they are. Don't impose lots of detailed scientific information. Trying to make sure we have guidance that is accessible for the people who need it most. So this is just an example of some of our Beat the Heat outreach. This, I know you can't see the details, don't worry about it. This is just a mock-up. We're working on a digital suite, or a very useful website is its interim name until it gets a real name. And we're working closely with local authorities in particular to find out what information do you want, what information is actionable to you, and how can we create a website that is your go-to place to get that information. We don't have to come up with everything. We can signpost to other resources in many cases. We can try and generate and create those data. So in some cases, it's just a searchable one-stop shop. And so we've finished a process of discovery and consultation, and we're doing some of the alpha phase work, and we're doing mock-ups, basically to try as much as possible to make the user experience good, because we can push out what we think is important, but what we really need to do is work with local authorities and our other stakeholders to give them what they want, when they want, and in the format they find accessible. So that's one of the pieces that we're working hard to do. And Tara, who's in the audience somewhere, is on my team and leading much of this work. Leadership and capacity. Here I want to talk about training. One of the biggest challenges in the UK, and from what I understand, I think it's the same in Ireland, is that there simply aren't enough people who know about climate and health. A lot of people are really trying to work in this space, but don't necessarily have access to the training and resources. So if you're in the medical or health field, engaging in climate research and science can be pretty impenetrable. And if you're a climate scientist, familiarity with sort of the needs and the information and the science on health can be very, very difficult. And bridging those, there are very few people who bridge those. And what we find is training is a huge, huge, huge problem. So what we need to do is a couple things. One, train the next generation of climate health professionals, train people from the bottom up in climate and health, and we do not have good extensive training in that. It's not there. I mean, we're not even starting from the bottom up. There are some programs that are doing this, but we're really not doing enough of it. People who start with climate and health expertise and can bridge that gap. We also need to support current professionals, and that might be many of you in the audience, in getting training to be able to understand more some of the depth of the other side. Because it tends to be that people have sort of one view of climate and health, but often not the kind of broader landscape. But really more importantly, it's about professionalizing climate and health, taking it out of advocacy and saying, this is a profession. We can look at this just like we do any other risk to health, just like we do any other environmental impact. Let's professionalize it and be pragmatic and go about working the way we deal with other challenges. Okay? We don't have to be paralyzed by this. We can move forward. So the UKHSA launched the Centre for Climate and Health Security. We're a toddler. We're about just over a year and a half old, really to bring together and coordinate leadership and partnership on climate and health, pull together all the different work we were doing, begin to fill in the gaps, and provide some leadership. And these are the 8 areas that we work across that I've been speaking about. And the goal, really, of all of this is to push towards kind of the next generation of public health that is climate sensitive. And so we don't just work in a silo or a bit of an octopus. We work across the agency so that the antimicrobial resistance team is thinking about climate, so that the gastro team is thinking about climate, so that the policy team, so that across the agency, when we think about health, we're considering climate. And taking this as a professional challenge. We are in charge of the future, right? We get to decide. We get to create those optimistic scenarios. It's looking for the win-win options, looking for the co-benefits and opportunities out there, not just the challenges. It's making sure that when we do our work, we're doing it evidence-based. So we do confidence assessments. We have line of sight on the work that we do. It's constantly evidence-based. And we try and communicate optimism and hope, because that's what we desperately need. And some of the literature and research really tells us that action is in some cases much more likely when facilitated by optimism and not fear. And so I think it's important we're really looking to pivot the climate and health space towards that optimism, those positive rather than those negative futures. And with that, I'll finish, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Lea. Can everyone hear me okay? So that was absolutely fantastic and insightful. In a minute, I am going to open it up to the audience. If you do have a question, maybe just pop your hand up and we're going to get the roving mic to go around. I work as a medical doctor in immunology, and I think everybody here will know that we are already pushed to breaking point in immunology and across the entire spectrum in the HSE, and I know you are with the NHS as well. So there's a lot of concern in what you're saying today. Just before I open it up to the room, could we touch a little bit more on what you were talking about there with antimicrobial resistance and the impacts climate change might have on that? Could you elaborate a little further on that?
Yeah.
Don't terrify us all too much.
Well, so antimicrobial resistance is when pathogens, we often think of bacteria, but it's not necessarily bacteria. It could be parasites, for example. So when pathogens are mutating to develop resistance, right? And if you think about it, that's really about it, the faster the cycle, the life cycle, and the replication of a pathogen is, the more chances it'll have to develop resistance. And many of these, heat will increase the rate of replication. So actually, from a kind of microbiology perspective, it's actually quite, it's quite plausible. And in fact, we're starting to see empirical evidence that that can in fact happen. So we can increase the likelihood or the speed at which resistance can develop. However, it's very poorly understood. It's still really in the early days. Sort of theoretically makes sense, and we are seeing kind of some early correlation evidence of it, but it's a really new field. But that's not all. Antimicrobial pollution, so this is when antimicrobials are used and get into the waste system and into the environment, can actually change the extent to which soils, for example, release greenhouse gases. Antimicrobial resistance also is a real problem for the health system. So if our treatments aren't effective, so it can increase burden on the health system, and the health system is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So actually that causal relationship can go both ways. What we also see is, globally, the places where we really need to make changes on climate change, and the places where we really need to make change and have recommendations for antimicrobial resistance are the same places. And a good example of that is agricultural systems. So on the one side, you have the antimicrobial people, AMR people, saying, well, we need to change the way we do farming. And on the other side, you have climate scientists say we have to totally transform landscape and agricultural systems, and those two aren't talking to each other. We literally have two totally separate visions for two major global challenges happening in the sort of the same systems, and they're not speaking. They have similar drivers. So the global transport of, the global movement of people and the global movement of animals. So lots of animals and lots of people flying around the world. Animals, those guys have a lot of stamps on their passports. Animals move a lot around the world. And that has implications for infectious disease, pandemic preparedness, antimicrobial resistance. The movement of people around the world, air travel also has implications for greenhouse gas emissions. If you think about our eating habits, heavy meat-based consumption is a contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and it's also meat-based consumption that drives livestock trade, animal welfare, and intensive agricultural systems, which drives antimicrobial resistance. So actually, when you start to dig deep down into these two challenges, which are treated as totally separate, you see, in fact, AMR and climate change are actually a joint web in the same space, and really we have to start thinking of these things together. And I was shocked because, as I had said, I thought there was really sort of no real connection beyond these are two challenges. But actually they're related both causally, shared drivers, shared solutions. They can both influence each other from a causal perspective. So actually climate change and AMR is a really interesting narrative that we're putting time into, and we've started to work at UKHSA between the Climate Centre and the AMR team to start to think about, well, should we be changing our surveillance? What should we be looking for? How can we be communicating in ways that can protect health?
Yeah, some joined up thinking is definitely needed. Okay, I'll open it up to the floor. So if you want to raise your hand, if you've got a question for Lea, just over here. If you just hang on for a second while the mic comes around to you.
Thank you, Laura. That was fantastic. I'm thinking about all the different sectors and the fact that everybody seems to have their own kind of agenda and this thing of joining the dots. But much of your language seems to be language that's reflected in the 7 quality management principles of ISO 9000. And I'm wondering, when you think of the farmer or some whatever sector it is there a need to make those principles that can be used in any sector or within any system management system, kind of everyday language, even for households?
That's a good question. I think my quick answer would be probably yes. I think there's a but in there, but I'm not. I'd have to think about it in terms of. I mean, standardization is always a good thing if we can have sort of a standard guidance that would provide a reasonable framework across different sectors for how to deal with sort of risks. So yes, if that solves problems, inevitably, I would suspect in implementation there might be nuances where it doesn't do everything we want it to. So imposing a standard doesn't always work. So it's classic one of those yes, no. So maybe. Gosh, this is not a very helpful answer, is it? We'd probably have to sit down and look at it and make sure. It's rare that one size fits all in reality, but there might be places where that's true. And I'll kind of we'd have to sit down and really map out and look at the ISO guidelines and see where it might actually provide that helpful framework, and where it might not. And I don't know where we would land in terms of the result from that type of assessment. But that's a helpful flag that we'll take a look at.
Over in the centre here, this gentleman.
Yeah, I was just wanted to ask, the presumption is that the heat effects that we often see in hot countries that already suffer from heat impact, that it would just be essentially the spreading of whatever they're currently facing, further into areas that never suffered from flooding or heat waves. But is it a possibility that that might not be the case, that what we might see in terms of the heat effects in England and stuff like that would not exactly be comparable to what might be already happening in places like Northern Africa or already heat, that like, for instance, mosquito stuff would operate differently in a different environment in which they've never been there before, and therefore the assumption it's not going to be as easy to plan that way, because mosquitoes might operate an awful lot differently in Ireland than they would already operate in sort of sub-Saharan Africa.
Absolutely, if only it were that easy. You're absolutely right, and that's sort of one of the core reasons for that is because, as I mentioned, climate change doesn't directly impact health. Its impacts are filtered through our existing vulnerabilities and our existing sort of ecology and society. So for example, even if we had a mosquito and a pathogen, if we have good diagnostic systems for something like malaria, even if the pathogen and the mosquito and we had transmission, which the UK has had in the past, autochthonous or domestic malaria transmission, it might be that our surveillance and diagnostic systems will mean that it's not a problem. So in many cases, things like strong healthcare systems will protect us. You mentioned, so for heat actually, we are in many cases more vulnerable. So the temperatures at which mortality starts to increase in, say, Spain or North Africa tend to be higher than in the UK. And I heard just today that maybe Ireland's even worse, and that basically we can't handle the heat. And that's not only our behaviors, but it's because of the way our houses are designed. It's because of the way our working days are designed. So we don't have siestas, we don't have shutters. We do things like go for jogs at 3 p.m. During a heat wave. And so in many cases, we could even be more vulnerable to the heat that they would get in other areas. So we could have increased vulnerability, or we could have decreased vulnerability through health systems. You mentioned the vector, which if we're looking at the vector ecology, it can be quite complex, a little more predictable in that we do tend to know what vectors like. So the modeling, if they've got the heat, they've got the water, they've got the habitat, and we should be able to model it. So yeah, you're right. The local aspects of where we live in the UK, in Ireland, will absolutely influence how these risks will impact us. In some cases it's protective, in some cases it's not.
There's another question just in front of that gentleman there.
Thank you, Professor Ford, for the informative session. So my name is Shruti. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at UCD. So I'm working in TRIGGER project, which is connecting the climate change and human health. So my question is for the past many years, we have been talking about the climate change, its causes and everything. And we know that man-made activities is one of the primary causes of climate change. And we also know it is directly climate change is having a direct impact on human health. But still, we are living in the era where we have to implement solutions, not in addition to discussing about this climate change. We need to have implementable solutions which have direct practical solutions. So my question is why is there still a gap between the research or maybe the studies on climate change on human health? Because we have plenty of researches on the impact of climate change on environmental impacts or socio-economic, economic assessment, etc. But still, because I had this doubt, because as one of the slides you presented, you mentioned about training sessions to the next generation. So I was just curious to know why still there's a gap on this climate change and human health. I know that still there are lots going on, but still it is not up to the expectation what is to be there at this point of time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And it's really about this gap between knowledge and action. And so there's some, there's some good behavioral theory on why it is that humans don't necessarily act upon the things that we know, and I don't think that's unique to climate change. So, some of the classic sort of early literature was on why it is that people do such a bad job of washing their hands, even though it's one of the best things we can do to protect our health, and that's even individual benefit, individual short-term benefit. In the case of climate change, it's so much more complicated because And I saw some great work done by the EPA just this afternoon, where people perceive that the impacts are happening to somebody else, somewhere else, and future generations. So there's not, and that's why I was really pushing this idea of it is not future generations, it's us, is because people perceive it's really somebody else's risk. And so kind of understanding and personalizing that risk is not something that happens. But there's a whole area of behavioral research around this gap in that knowledge and awareness does not necessarily translate into action across the board, and climate change and health is I think, unfortunately, a really good example of that. And to me, one of the implications is who needs to take action. So another analogy is smoking. So in the early days of smoking, public health campaigns tended to target individuals. And so the sort of classic ad was, here's your lung regularly, here's your lung, if you smoke. And it was pretty scary, right? Some of you may remember this from when you were younger. And what the research found is not only did people not stop smoking, some of them were so stressed they went off and had a cigarette. And so what they found was that knowledge didn't lead to action, and what was effective is a population level public health approach when we started to do things like make smoke-free spaces. So not targeting individual behavior, but smoke-free spaces. We're seeing a similar trend in our public health response to things like obesity, that it's less effective to say, you should just eat better and exercise, and it's more effective to look at these obesogenic environments. So I think there's translatability of some of those insights potentially to climate change, and that it may not just be individual behavior. It may be thinking about what those population level shifts and policy and government leadership might need to be. Of course, that requires public pressure and prioritization on governments to do that. But so in some cases, the solution is actually to take a population level approach, and not an individual guilt doesn't always work. I don't know, and I haven't seen a lot of that work, but my suspicion is these lessons from tobacco and obesity will probably be translatable to the types of the sort of gap that you're talking about in climate and health action.
I'm just thinking, though, people still smoke and people are still obese, and I don't think we have the time to wait for climate change. This is the eternal question, and I don't know who's going to be able to answer it, but what is it going to take to make the action happen? It happened with COVID, the world took action, and then we kind of forgot about it. So what's it going to take for people to take the action for climate change? The eternal question.
This is on YouTube, right? The optimist in me would say that we are making progress. It's not fast enough, but we are making progress. The progress that we're making will continue and probably accelerate, and I am optimistic about that. It'll just come with the costs. The delays that we have will come at a cost to lives, and those lives will be among the most vulnerable. The pessimist in me says that what it'll take is a severe extreme weather event, something like a heat wave that really has striking mortality associated with it. I would hope that it doesn't take that type of event to stimulate action to accelerate, and I hope that we're lucky, but it's very possible that it would take a fairly catastrophic event to really kind of push people into doing something. And a very severe heat wave with really bad timing in the UK or in Ireland, or very, very severe flooding are perfectly plausible events that could happen and have really severe impacts on health. And I think we need to be ready for that. okay? And try and avoid that. So what would it take? It may take that. I hope that it doesn't, and I don't think it needs to. I think if we continue with a sense of optimism, making progress and constantly accelerating, I think we could stay below 2 degrees, and I think we could probably just coast and make it on that curve. But it's going to take a lot of, it's going to need passion, not cynicism.
I like your way of looking at it. We have another question in the middle over here.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk. Niall Roach is my name. I'm with the Environmental Health Service of the Health Service Executive. And I suppose I just want to pick up on that because it needs to take a severe event. But I was reading the European Climate Risk Assessment recently, and you know, between 60 and 70,000 people died in Europe in 2022. And if that was an earthquake, there would be a major cry. But we didn't see much in the media, I have to say, because when I was in France at the time, I saw a lot of media coverage of forest fires in the south of France. And even here in Ireland, you might see children queuing for ice cream, or you might see them playing in a paddling pool. And I wanted to ask you about the role of the media, and what do you feel as a stakeholder in your action plan in terms of how you work with the media to ensure that we communicate the severity and the seriousness of these challenges in terms of threats to health, but also as you try to implicate the opportunities for health, is that we realise that there is an opportunity and a co-benefit for health. So my question is really on the role of the media and how you work with the media as a stakeholder in this whole area of climate action on health. Thank you.
It's a great question. And this idea that I shared on really trying to emphasize a shared vision is something relatively new. So I think we're going in that direction. I don't know if I have an answer of sort of, I don't think we've reached necessarily that point where we have a strategic, specific relationship with the media on optimism, but certainly we're working in that direction. There has been some criticism, and we've been in discussions with some academics who wanted to study the use of imagery for climate change. So when there's a heat wave, the images are of people on beaches, right? The images are not of the social care facility with older people who are really struggling. And so thinking about the image, that was coming out of a university and academic organization, that particular project. But yeah, there is some really interesting sort of research and movement towards thinking about that. I would say, because we've only been around for a year and a half, and that first year we were working on core deliverables under the National Adaptation Programme for the UK's Climate Change Act. So I don't think we've quite got there yet. It's more on the agenda moving forward to begin thinking about that level. I mean, when you look at your priorities, sort of tracking down the mosquitoes, heat health alerts, the visioning stuff is rising up the agenda, but it's not to the level that I can give you. I can give you an answer of exactly how we've perfected it. But come back to me in 2 years, and maybe I'll have a really great answer.
Just over here.
Thank you. Thank you for your lecture. These EPA lectures started, I think, maybe around 2006, 2007, and it was a time of great optimism. We had Howard Stern, who produced a very good economic report that just showed that it made economic sense to address climate change immediately. And we had Al Gore's film on Inconvenient Truth, and the IPCC people got the Nobel Prizes. One of the authors and one of the recipients is in the room. And at the time, we really thought, we all spoke 10 to 15 years to get this right, and that's 15 years ago. And our emissions have continued to rise. And you're now talking quite openly there about a 2-degree rise, when Paris was talking about 1.5 degrees. So suddenly we're gone, and that half a degree makes a huge difference. When I see the issue of climate change and human health, you have to come back to the idea of an existential threat, because there are tipping points. And so it won't be just mosquitoes. It could be much more severe. And when you talk about catastrophic flooding, it could be 7 meters of flooding, 7 meters high. If you looked at the recent RT a documentary or a 3-part series on the melting in Greenland, you know, you're talking about a drop in ice of 10 meters per year in some parts. So there are potentially really significant changes coming down. And to some extent, Laura asked the question that I wanted to ask. And there has been a recent European Court of Human Rights judgment which brings some hope that we might be able to use the courts to force our politicians to do what the people want to do. But there is a massive gap between the desire of the population and the ability or the willingness of the politicians to take the actions that are necessary because, and you've referred to smoking earlier, there's a massive pushback from vested interests. And all we have to do is look at the recent proposed legislation on nature conservation and how the farmers across Europe they just coordinated. Signals were sent. They drove their big tractors into the cities, and suddenly the whole thing just collapsed. And so we, as people who are concerned about this issue, need to be aware that we are in a massive struggle and fight. And I just wondered if you have any views on the use of the courts, for example, the European Court, to force governments to make the changes that are necessary. Thank you.
So I am government. UKHSA is government, so that is an unanswerable question. I cannot comment on using the courts to force the government that I work for to do it, so unfortunately I plead the whatever I can plead. So there's going to be different ways of addressing climate change. Civil society and advocacy and civil disobedience is one pathway. The courts and legislation, regulation are another pathway. We're just on a different pathway. It's complementary. There's going to be a different role. The pathway we're on is really to push as hard as we can to move evidence and to generate the evidence so we have a case for action. So the work that we do will not be the only thing that moves us forward. So there's going to be a role for courts. There's going to be a role for civil society. There's going to be a role for the private sector. Those aren't the roles I can speak to, except that we will work alongside them, and it's going to be that cumulative action. One of the things I did want to mention, because I think you're right, I think getting people to sort of understand the real nature of the challenge, both the complexity and the extent. And again, I keep coming back to this sort of visioning piece. One of the things we did very early on in the center is to get people together and do some scenario exercises. And this came out of some work I did. I was invited by the Ministry of Defense to come to some scenario exercises. And what we do is you lay out an example future. So we put people, gave them a narrative, a storyline, and said, you're in 2035. There's been a major heat wave. It comes right on several major floods. There's migration crises, a lot of migration pressure, for example. Maybe that's resulted in far right movements. Maybe there's advocacy, maybe there's other political challenges. We create this narrative, essentially a plausible future that's not limited to, but that's based on sort of a climate challenges. Base it in 2035. Put people in a room from different backgrounds. In our case, we did it internally within the UKHSA, and said, spend some time thinking about this scenario, what it would mean, what would be the implications for the UKHSA, and importantly, let's backcast and say, what are the things that we could be doing today to prepare for that? And we used 3 different scenarios. One was a global food security migration, one was vector-borne disease, and one was around heat and flooding. And then we ended by saying, well, what are the commonalities in the things that we can do today to make us more resilient to that? And this kind of approach is phenomenally effective at getting people to viscerally kind of understand the risks. So the reason I brought it to our center is because when I was in that room for the Ministry of Defense session that I was invited to attend, it was the first time in my career that I viscerally understood climate change. I felt it at an emotional level that I hadn't before, and I realized that that storytelling, that narrative, that visioning was such a powerful way of getting people engaged and understanding it. And I had been working in this field for well over a decade. I don't know, I'd have to count, but let's not. I'd been working in the field for quite some time, and when we did that internally, people across the agency, working in divisions that had nothing to do previously with climate change, said the same thing. They said they really sort of understood the complexity, and these things that seem like really scary scenarios are actually very feasible. And they're not wildly out there. They're feasible, plausible scenarios, and 2035 is not that far away. So I think that's why we talk about the shared vision, and that's why I keep pushing that. I think we need to be more creative about the ways we engage people to help bring the salience of the challenge to people, but also in a way that's solutions focused. So that exercise wasn't to send you out scared. That exercise is to truly understand the complexities and to identify, well, what are the things that we can do right now that might make us more resilient to these different types of scenarios. And sometimes you get surprising answers, right? Sometimes those things you identify are not the things you're doing, or not even the things that are on your business plan. So I want us to be more creative about dealing with exactly that problem, because otherwise we get caught up in cynicism. I do think there needs to be radical optimism and radical pragmatism in saying, what are the methods we can use to actually do this differently? And so we'll hopefully be doing more of that type of work to engage people.
I think on that note, and with hopefully a lot more optimism in the room afterwards than when we started, I will say thank you so much to Lea for your insights and participation this evening. We'd also like to thank our audience for your questions, your participation. You will receive a post-event survey via email, so please give us your feedback. Your input will help us to plan our future events. The EPA would also like to announce this evening that registration is now open for the annual EPA Climate Conference, which will be held in Dublin Castle on May 15th. Registration details can be found on the EPA website, and details will also be emailed to attendees of this evening's lecture. So good night, and thank you so much all for joining us.